Hey everybody, if you have already tried to watch the first video, you know that this is the second recording because even though I could hear the video on my own computer, when I uploaded it to YouTube and played it there, it didn't play. I didn't know that till after I posted it. So some of you uh, may have tried to listen to a video that didn't play. The good news about my having to record this twice is that hopefully now that this is my second go round, I'll be able to be a little more concise. So let's get going. All right, so this is my feedback for Module 2. And I had some really big questions around Module 2 that came to me actually both from reading your responses and thinking that maybe there were some other questions that we should have looked at simultaneously, and also reading Dr. Furwy's his questions themselves and thinking, well, he asked great questions, but there were probably a couple he should have asked on top of it. So here are the big questions for me as I was thinking about all this. And I admit this is the second time I was teaching this course, but the first time I was just trying to get my head around what was going on in the classroom because I had 4 days to prep. This time I am really familiar with the material and I thought about it a little more deeply. So again, here are the big questions for me. First of all, are these truly utopia projects? How would we know that they are utopia projects? Every one of these stories was, it was a snapshot in time of what had happened or what was going on in these projects until now. And for me, they begged certain questions like, what about in the long term? Also, how do we know that they're truly innovative? Just for example, just to take 3 off the top of my head because I didn't memorize all of them, but there are bike collectives all over the country. So what makes the particular bike collective that Dr. Furwy gave us to read about different than other and more innovative than other bike collectives? And what about microlending? I don't know if you know this, it's like a hot topic these days, but actually microlending has been a thing for centuries, really. I mean, we're talking centuries back into like ancient Greece and stuff like that. And there are many groups like Fresh Start, the group that prepares women to re-enter the workforce all over the country. So what makes these particular projects utopia projects or more innovative, have more impact than anything else? And then alongside of that, Lily, one of your classmates, asked some interesting questions like, can a nonprofit be entrepreneurial? And again, this goes to what exactly are we talking about in the big sense when we're talking about entrepreneurial? So I'm going to address some of these big picture questions because I don't feel like we were critical enough of the programs. We were looking for what was amazing and innovative, and there's a lot there to get our minds around. But we have to be able to differentiate between things that are great ideas and things that actually were true innovations that had impact, the kind of impact that we want. And if you think about it, we know that it's kind of a broad generalization, very broad because it depends on the area that you're in, but they say that only 10% of all the needs that nonprofits and social enterprises try to fix or solve those problems get met, and the other 90% is going unmet. That's one of the reasons we need innovation, and one of the reasons we want to scale up, and one of the reasons that we're always looking for better ways, better mousetraps, right? So we need to know whether an idea, just because it's new, it might be innovative, but does it have that impact, right? Innovation is great, but throwing out creative ideas can happen all the time, and they may or may not have the effect that we're looking for. So, okay, so how can we tell whether or not these ideas are actually utopia projects, are true innovations that lead to enhanced impact in a major way? So for me, the answer to those questions have to take into account more than just the idea, whether that's a bike collective, workforce preparation, microlending. We have to look at how this particular version of the idea has been implemented in a new way or a different way so that it has greater impact than any of the other similar ideas that have come before. And how will we prove with data that that implementation happened? Great ideas on paper sometimes don't work that well in real life. And that's because of many possible reasons. People don't accept these good ideas, they're not ready for them, or they don't fit in with the culture, they're too different, and people just can't get with the program, or problems are truly systems problems that emerge from multiple factors in the system that you can't just change one thing, even innovatively, and expect the whole problem to go away. And there's probably other ideas too, like just flat out bad ideas, but we'll just put those to the side. So we need data that helps show us how the impact, what kind of an impact we have. And we'd also like some data that explains the impact. And we also need to look not just at these stories that are kind of snapshots in time of great ideas that people wanted to write about, but that look at the ideas and their impacts over time. And not just at the ideas and the people for whom they were implemented, but the indirect impacts or the larger impacts. What about the individual's family? How did their participation in a particular program impact their family? How did it change the community? How did it change the system from which the problem emerged? And was the change positive or was it negative? And how could it be negative, you might ask? I'm going to tell you a story. I may have told you the story before because it's a good story for illustrating a certain point. And so if I have, bear with me. But many women's empowerment programs have been instituted in third world countries where women have traditionally had very little power. And especially through the United Nations and a lot of academic folks who have wanted to go in and try various empowerment projects. And what they've done is they've taken these ideas, maybe with and maybe without ABCD, and maybe they've gone to the women and they've basically said, you know, do you want to be empowered? Oh, yes, we'd love to be empowered. Here's some ideas. Do any of these sound like things you'd be willing to do? Oh, yes, we'd be willing to do this. Oh, if you give us some training, we would be willing to try that. But what they didn't do, even though it was women's empowerment and they asked the women, was they didn't bring in the bigger community. Now, women do not live in a vacuum. They live in households, often with husbands, sometimes without, but often with husbands or helpmates, often with children in third world countries, often with extended family. And of course, those families exist in the part of a larger community. So what has happened, not everywhere, not every program, because there are varieties, but in enough, we see that women's power as it rose disempowered the men in their families in ways that did not reverberate well for their marriages and their family and their community. And even though if you ask the husbands if it was a good idea, if their wives had more economic viability and could bring in more stuff into the household, they might have told you yes. They might also tell you that it changed the dynamic in their household for the worse. So we've now studied these programs long enough to have this feedback and to realize that some of these programs had unexpected and negative consequences for families. And even if they have a little more money in their households were doing more poorly and in social and relational ways. So one of the things that we've learned from that is that ABCD shouldn't just talk to the women who need empowering, but should talk to families, and they should look for benefits to families, because when the men and the elders of the community and others are brought into the process and they can figure out how this works best for them as couples, as families, as communities, then everybody sees the benefit and everybody's brought in. And actually, there may be ways in which the men can enable and facilitate their wives and mates' empowerment in ways that make them feel better. So now that we know that, we realize that great ideas sometimes have unintended consequences. Okay, so when we talk about looking for the impact, we're also looking for the impact not just to the individual, but to the family, to the community, to the social fabric, to the economic fabric of that community. All right, so what else? How else might we be thinking about these things? So let's take microfinance. How do we know that something's really successful? Well, it turns out that microfinance isn't always very successful, and there is a lot of feedback that suggests that microfinance actually has had some negative repercussions that were never expected. Of course, there are a lot of different programs, and some of them have been more successful than others, but many of them have left the borrowers in more debt, and so we're studying that now. And I am leaving you some links in the announcement that will show you some of the problems with microfinance. But I'd like to suggest a couple. So this goes to making sure that even if you are doing ABCD, that you think through with your community the cultural fit. So think about the ramifications of bringing a competitive, market-driven financial mechanism, loans, transactions, into a community-driven culture. So the market is based around the idea that each of us as individual, if we maximize our skills and we work hard, can get ahead as individuals. And of course, that brings our family with us. And the Western thinking is that brings the whole community with us. But if you look at some of the African countries in particular, you will see, and actually some of the Asian countries, you will see that they approach their entire philosophy of life and community differently. Rather than individual rights and individual hard work, they put the rights of the whole community ahead of the rights of the individual. If you've heard the term Ubuntu, the idea is that what is good for the community is good for the individual, that a healthy community can take care of individuals and can ensure the success of individuals as opposed to the other way around. Now, what if you put a market-driven, westernized mechanism into a community-driven culture? You'd really have to think through how you could employ this in a community-oriented way and not a westernized individual rights kind of a way. Okay, so, and again, I've given you some articles that talk to this. Let's also think about, who's writing these stories. The people who are writing these stories are often very invested in these ideas. They're often the researchers or academicians or the program managers or organizations who have thought up these ideas and are in love with their ideas and very invested in them. And maybe or maybe not, can they see the forest for the trees? While I love every single one of the stories that Dr. Foroughi put forth for us, and they all have a lesson to teach us about breaking out of molds, these stories tend not to follow projects over the long term into the future to see what the effects of the disruption are in, the concentric circles that come out over time across larger units, how it impacts organizations, how it impacts families, how it impacts communities, etc. And sometimes that story would show that they truly did make a large and wonderful impact. And sometimes it might show us something else, like the story I just told you about women's empowerment. And again, microfinance has been one of those with very mixed-based results. So we need to really be able to evaluate these programs and not just in a momentary, limited sort of way to find out if they really are the end-all, be-all that we would hope for if something was a utopian project. Now, I'm not saying these all aren't. I'm just saying that I didn't see that we asked that question, and I think we need to. Okay, so let's talk about let's just take this further and let's look at one of the programs that actually looks to me like it's a success so far, and I did a little more research into it, like I did into some of the others. to find you some alternative readings. And let's just look at Grayston. Grayston is that company that hires anybody. If they have 10 open jobs, they take the first 10 in line. They don't ask questions. They don't test you. They don't get your references. If you are there, if you got yourself there to get a job, they will give you a chance. All right, so Grayston has so far been very successful at putting people to work using its model. But I was curious about the inherent conflict, both the business model conflict and the ethical conflict of the idea that it's a business, and even though it's a social enterprise, which means they found a mechanism for raising their social purpose to be equally as important as their profit, and they do need to make a profit to sustain themselves so that they can create the social purpose, right? Those things are both equally necessary. That there may come a time when their business purpose conflicts with their social purpose, and it's not that it's a bad thing. And I'm going to walk you through this, and there's going to be a moral to the end of the story. So right now they're fine. They make yummy brownies and they are competitive. But remember, they are a for-profit organization and they're competing with other brownie makers, right? So what happens when the day comes when there is this amazing new automated baking piece of equipment that automates part of the brownie making process and thereby allows a company to release some of its employees and be replaced by this automation thing. And anybody who uses that is now going to be able to bring their price point of the brownies down because they pay less people and they've got their investment in their machine, but that's a one-time investment as opposed to paying people on an ongoing basis. So now if you are the company that is always employing people and your competitors, in other words, your Grayston, and your competitors suddenly can sell their brownies a lot cheaper than you can, you have a quandary. And it's not just a business model quandary or a business making decision. It is also an ethical decision. And why is that? Because your whole social purpose, half of your purpose, is to keep people employed. But in order to be competitive so that you meet your other purpose, which is profit making, which allows you to do your social purpose, you've got to use that same automation so that you can drop your price and stay competitive and stay in the market. Otherwise, people are going to slowly stop buying your brownies unless there's some other amazing way that you can justify charging them more for them. But otherwise, people are going to stop buying your brownies and your doors are going to slowly close and you're going to have to let people go anyway. So here we have a situation where our need to let people go is antithetical to our social mission, and yet our need to let people go is what will preserve our ability to stay in business. And I guess the point that I'm making to you is that when you're thinking about truly innovative and impact, you have to think about not just does this work at the moment, but how is it going to work off into the future? And of course, I've created a hypothetical, but I guess, and this gets back to Lily's point, I think, about, what business model are we using? Can a nonprofit be an innovator, a social entrepreneur? And I guess I would say that if Grayston got to that point, one of the things that it could do is it could become a nonprofit. And then it could not only make money making brownies, but it could also obtain grants and do fundraisers, and it could fill the price point with donations that allowed them to keep all the people employed while lowering the price point of their brownies. And so the moral to this story is there are many, many business models. And it doesn't matter if you are a nonprofit or a social enterprise. What matters is what is the best way to make the biggest impact. And I always tell my nonprofit students, the best way to make the biggest impact is the right way, whatever that way is. And you don't pick I'm going to be a social enterprise. I'm going to be a business and I'm going to make it work, or I'm going to be a nonprofit. What you do is you say, what is the most efficient and most effective way to get from ground zero to achieving our mission. And then if it looks like, and then you pick the business model that fits. So if being a business is the most sustainable way to throw off money to get your social mission done, then you do that. But if something in the environment changes, like an automation that you have to get if you're going to stay competitive, and your business model is no longer good for getting you your social mission, then maybe you change your business model. And I'll give you an example of that. So many of you have probably heard of Seventh Generation. It is the very first green entry into the toiletries and cleaning supply that are all sustainable. They did things like not only get sustainably sourced and fair trade palm oil products, but they went down to the palm oil farms in South America, and they enlisted farmers who were willing to learn sustainability farming practices. They taught them, they worked with them, they financed their learning and helped them make the changes, they financed their changes that they needed to become sustainable. And then they contracted with them, only with those people who would do that, so that they really changed the game, not only for Seventh Generation products, but they demonstrated for, Clorox and Johnson & Johnson and all of those other products that it could be done, and started a thing that reverberated through the industry. At some point, they went public to get the money to do the things that they wanted to do. I mean, the things I'm talking about are R&D stuff, and they needed a lot of money to do it, right? So they went public. They had an IPO. They sold shares, whatever. Down the road, they began to see that their required fiduciary duties as a public company to elevate their shareholder needs above their social mission was interfering with their ability to do their social mission, because the decisions that would benefit their shareholders were going to hurt their social mission. And so they made a giant decision to go back in and buy up. They got a private investor who was a social investor to help them afford to buy up all their shares of outstanding public stock, and they took their company back private so that they could keep their social mission up there. In other words, there was a time when a public company was the model that helped them get off the ground, but there was a time when that model was no longer the model that was going to help them meet their social mission. So the thing is not to pick the business model. The thing is to pick the path and then get the business model that enables the path, if that makes any sense. I have also found a really interesting reading for you about that uses Greyston as an example, but also talks about how to pick your business model and the risks and challenges of innovation from a business perspective. Okay, so let's go back to Lily's question of social entrepreneur be a nonprofit? Can a nonprofit be a social entrepreneur? So let's just do a little clarification of terms. So enterprise, entrepreneur, they sort of start the same, ENT, right? Enter. They're not unrelated, but they're not the same. Entrepreneurial behavior is somebody who looks for creative, innovative, and often risky, but not necessarily, but often risky ways of trying something new. And the risk that comes with it is not generally risk that something won't work, but more the risk of the unknown, because whenever we try something new, we just don't know if it's going to work. Again, we have great ideas on paper. When we try to implement them, they may not work. I told you the example of the Grameen Bank or the micro lending, and you will see those stories. I told you about, not that the women's empowerment things didn't work, it empowered the women, but the kind of consequences that they didn't anticipate. And I'll give you another example from history. If you remember Head Start, which is still very much alive, Head Start was started to give kids who come from impoverished households the same kind of boost of help with, the kinds of reading and the contextual stuff that helped kids be ready for kindergarten and first grade. Actually, when they started, there wasn't any first grade. So Head Start was, there wasn't any kindergarten. So Head Start was like a kindergarten program. It's now preschool. But anyway, what they did was they gave the same opportunities to kids who couldn't afford to go to a paid kindergarten or wasn't getting that kind of stuff at home, so that by the time they hit first grade, they were at the same level readiness for learning. And they figured that if they raised those kids to the same level of readiness, that would launch them well. Well, over the years, as they began getting data back, what they noticed was they did get that launch boost, but it only lasted until second or third grade. By second or third grade, some other factors, some other variables in the system that, the context of the school or the home or the community or all of it, led to those kids being back down to some place below the kids that were more advantaged. So Head Start did not actually, over the long term, do what it was supposed to do. If you only measured it for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, you were good. But by the time you got to third grade, they saw this drop. So the thing is, you may know that Head Start's still around, and the reason for that was it threw off some amazing indirect benefits. It brought all kinds of resources to the table, kind of like Grayston does, except for families rather than individuals. And it also brought a place where people could come together and feel good about themselves and their community. And so even though Head Start showed that it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, the families that were part of it asked for it to remain, and it has remained. But the people who were looking for that boost to keep kids on a level playing field had to go back to the drawing board. They still haven't figured it out. But my point is, we don't always know whether something is going to play out successfully or not. So when we are looking for that utopia, let's just kind of go back and review what it is we need to be thinking about. First of all, ABCD needs to truly be the community. It can't just be the woman that you're trying to empower or the, etc. So we don't want to impose a solution without thinking about all of the ramifications, social, cultural, as well as economic, and not just the people who are implementing it thinking about them, but thinking about them with the entire community. 2, without being invited to bring those ideas to the community. And 3, without creating the kind of benchmarks along the way that help us determine whether, in fact, the wonderful program that we have planned is taking us in the direction of, that we hoped we were going, or whether we see that we're not really getting there. If we have benchmarks along the way, then we can stop, assess, decide whether we're getting where we want to go, and adjust stuff. Well, this isn't working. What are all the reasons why it's not working? And how can we get ourselves there? And then 4, at those benchmarks, what are the indicators that we're looking for? What will tell us that we're going in the right direction or not? How will we know? So those are the points that I want to make for you. 1, don't just assume that because it's a great story now, it's really a utopia. 2, remember not only the immediate impacts, but what are the long-term impacts, the indirect impacts to the individuals, families, partnerships, relationships, community, and larger socioeconomic environment. 3, how are we going to know if we're succeeding or failing? What does success look like? What indicators would tell us whether we are making success, and how will we collect those indicators? And 4, where do we want to stop? What are the natural stopping points to benchmark these things? Now, let me say one last thing about measuring these things. When you think about a utopia, I think it helps to think about what is the project's mission statement and vision statement. Now, we all know that a mission statement is the statement of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So if we are a program that wants to eradicate hunger in Phoenix, or at least let's narrow it. Let's say that what we want to do is make sure that nobody has to go hungry in Phoenix. All right, maybe eradicating hunger is a little large, but let's just say that we have as a mission making sure that nobody, or we have as a vision making sure that nobody in Phoenix has to be hungry. All right, that's our vision. Nobody in Phoenix has to be hungry. What is our mission? Our mission is, let's just plan a program off the top of my head. Our mission is that we're going to go to all of the restaurants and all of the food processors and all of the grocery stores, and we're going to collect all of everybody's end of day unused food, and we're going to distribute it out in all the ways that we can to reach people who might not be able to otherwise have a meal. All right, so we have a pretty narrow project. It involves making a network of people who work with food during the day, grocery stores, food processors, and restaurants, and a network of people who, can go pick that stuff up and deliver it somewhere, and a network of people or organizations who are good distributors, whether that's community centers, shelters, churches, I don't know, whatever they all are, you can think of them. So that's our program. It's pretty narrow, right? And then our vision is to make sure that, that if somebody needs food in any given day, it's available to them and that they know where to get it. Okay. So whenever you are looking to see whether or not your program is taking you toward that vision of, if anybody is ever hungry, they know where to get food, that there's always food available, they don't have to be hungry on any given day, that's a great benchmark. And as you are trying to measure something, you can ask yourself, is what we're seeing here getting us toward that goal, or is it getting us somewhere else? And so a first place to look for what to measure is, what are the components of actually achieving our vision? And those might be some of your measurements. And then other components are much more standard components. How many people are we serving? How is this changing the lives of the people that we're serving, and so forth. And I won't go into all of that because hopefully all of you have had that kind of evaluation stuff, although I will give you an article to help you figure out how to evaluate innovative stuff. But that's the bigger piece, is if this is truly innovative, we need to see that we're actually getting to the vision. Not that it's just a vision that's out there, or not that it's just a cloud that we can't reach, but that actually this innovation is making it possible to get closer to the vision than we were able to get before we started this particular project. That's how we'll know that it's truly innovative. Before we couldn't reach that vision. Now we are closer. We are twice as close. We're doing twice as much as we were before, 3 times as much, whatever it is. Okay, those are my thoughts. And I'm going to let you go, and I hope that you enjoy, this is Saturday all day. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your long weekend, and I will see you back on the boards pretty soon. I'm about to go grade your Module 3.